Some people sit down to work and feel resistance immediately. Not physical resistance, cognitive resistance. The mind drifts, attention slips, the urge to escape appears before deep thought even begins. And eventually, many people start believing they lost their discipline. But often, the deeper problem is that their nervous system has been trained for interruption for so long that depth now feels unnatural. The modern world does not only distract attention, it conditions the brain to avoid sustained thought, and slowly, the ability to enter deep flow begins disappearing. This is where the Neural Alchemist begins. You are not lazy. You are trying to think deeply with a nervous system trained for interruption. This is the quiet crisis of modern cognition. The world asks people to create meaningful work inside environments designed to fracture attention constantly. Notifications interrupt thought before it fully stabilizes. Open loops remain active beneath the surface of the mind, and eventually, the brain stops entering depth naturally, not because intelligence disappeared, not because discipline became impossible, but because the internal architecture of attention has become overloaded. Too many notifications, too many open loops, too many signals competing for one mind. And slowly, mental friction begins accumulating. Beneath everyday life, one distraction feels harmless, but hundreds of small interruptions, repeated every day, quietly condition the brain to avoid sustained thought. This is why so many people now feel mentally blocked before meaningful work even begins. Because the modern mind is no longer struggling only with effort, it is struggling with cognitive overload. And this is where the Neural Alchemist begins, not by forcing the mind harder, but by rebuilding the conditions that allow depth to return. Flow is not magic. Flow is architecture, the result of a body regulated enough, a mind clear enough, and an environment quiet enough for attention to remain continuous. Most people believe deep work comes from intensity. Push harder, work longer, optimize everything. But many people are not blocked because they lack effort. They are blocked because their nervous system is carrying too much friction. Poor sleep, constant notifications, too much stimulation, too little recovery, too many tasks competing for one mind, and eventually, attention begins scattering before depth can stabilize. This is why the first stage of the Neural Alchemist is not acceleration, it is cleansing. Remove the unnecessary, lower the noise, reduce the open loops, create an environment where the brain no longer feels forced to scan constantly for novelty and interruption. Because flow does not begin when the mind is forced harder. It begins when resistance is removed. This is where the architecture of flow begins. Most people never notice how much energy is lost through invisible cognitive friction. A single notification, an unfinished decision, a browser tab left open in the background of the mind. Small things, but repeated constantly, and eventually, attention stops feeling stable. The mind begins scanning automatically for novelty, for stimulation, for escape. Even silence starts feeling uncomfortable. This is the hidden friction of the modern nervous system, not physical exhaustion, cognitive exhaustion, because every unresolved input continues consuming attention, even when awareness moves elsewhere. And slowly, mental clarity begins fragmenting beneath constant interruption. This is why the Neural Alchemist begins rebuilding attention physically. One clear desk, one objective, one uninterrupted block of focus, a notebook nearby, the phone outside the room, noise reduced before depth begins. Because focus is heavily shaped by environment, and many people now struggle to remain present with a single task for longer than a few minutes, not because the brain became weaker, but because distraction has become behavioral conditioning. The Neural Alchemist understands that deep focus is not created through force. It emerges when friction is removed and attention finally stops scattering. And this is where depth begins returning again. The modern nervous system has become addicted to interruption, not because people are weak, but because constant stimulation has quietly reshaped attention itself. The urge to check the phone, the impulse to switch tasks, the discomfort that appears after only a few minutes of stillness. These reactions feel automatic because they have been repeated thousands of times, and eventually, the brain begins associating silence with absence, stillness with boredom, depth with resistance. This is why many people now struggle to remain fully present inside meaningful work, not because they lost intelligence, but because distraction has become neurological habit. The Neural Alchemist understands that rebuilding focus requires retraining the nervous system itself. One uninterrupted hour, one task completed slowly, one moment resisted without escaping into stimulation, and gradually, attention begins stabilizing again, not through force, through repetition, because depth does not return. Because the mind is forced, it returns. When the nervous system learns safety inside stillness, and eventually, what once felt uncomfortable begins feeling peaceful. This is where deep focus stops feeling impossible. Eventually, something begins changing, not dramatically, not instantly, but slowly. The nervous system stops craving constant stimulation. The urge to escape weakens. Attention stabilizes longer. Silence stops feeling threatening. And gradually, the mind begins recovering its natural depth again. Thoughts become clearer. Work becomes more immersive. Time begins slowing down. Inside focused attention, because deep focus changes the experience of reality itself. One uninterrupted hour often feels more meaningful than entire days, lost inside fragmented stimulation. This is the hidden transformation most people never experience long enough to fully understand, because the modern world keeps training the mind to abandon depth too early. But the Neural Alchemist understands that attention is one of the deepest forms of power. Whatever continuously captures it eventually shapes identity, and whatever protects it begins rebuilding coherence from the inside out. This is why deep focus is not only productivity, it is the recovery of clarity, of presence, of inner coherence. And eventually, the mind no longer feels fragmented by everything around it. And once the mind can enter depth again, a different question appears. What should that depth create? Most people spend years trying to optimize output without realizing the deeper problem was never output alone. It was attention, because attention quietly shapes the architecture of an entire life. Whatever repeatedly captures it eventually begins directing thought, behavior, emotion, identity. And this is why the modern world fights so aggressively for human attention itself, because attention is no longer just awareness. It is economic value, behavioral influence, psychological territory, and eventually, people begin losing the ability to distinguish between intentional living and automatic reaction. This is why the Neural Alchemist does not only protect focus, it protects consciousness itself. One intentional morning, one uninterrupted conversation, 1 hour lived fully, without psychological fragmentation, These moments appear small, but they quietly rebuild coherence across an entire life, because in the end, deep focus was never only about productivity, it was about reclaiming the ability to fully experience reality again. And maybe this is what so many people are truly searching for now. Not more stimulation, not more optimization, not more noise, but the ability to hear their own thoughts clearly again. And this is where the Neural Alchemist becomes a way of living. But flow is not the final architecture, because once the mind can finally enter depth, the next question appears: can that depth become visible execution?